This is also a time of change for my family.
No one in the room was prepared for what King Charles was about to read. The morning at the palace began perfectly normally. Files were neatly arranged on his desk. Private secretaries stood awaiting instructions, and the king prepared to attend to a series of familiar monarchical duties. Then, a sealed envelope was placed before him. On the envelope was Meghan's name. Charles initially assumed it was merely a charitable proposal, perhaps a new collaborative project, or an attempt to ease the long-standing family tensions. But as soon as he turned the first page, the king's expression changed. Meghan had not asked permission to return to royal service, nor had she offered to support Catherine during the Princess of Wales' temporary reduction in public duties. Meghan officially requested temporary control over the Queen's Covenant for Children and Families, a patronage personally bestowed upon Catherine by the late Queen Elizabeth II and protected by specific palace directives. This was no symbolic title. The holder of this patronage could represent the monarchy access senior advisors, direct major charitable programs, and leverage the monarchy's influence to mobilize domestic and international support. In their submission, Meghan's team argued that the covenant needed a woman capable of taking the organization beyond British borders, attracting global donors and building partnerships the palace had been unable to achieve. But hidden beneath the carefully chosen words was a message that was difficult to interpret otherwise. Catherine was no longer capable of leading. Charles read the first page. Then he turned back and read it again from the beginning. The room fell silent, so quiet you could hear the paper ticking against the table. The king wasn't angry. He didn't issue any orders. He simply took off his glasses and stared intently at a phrase that appeared in the submission. The position is vacant. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what follows this petition will not only shake the relationship between Meghan and Catherine, but will also force King Charles to choose between family pressure and Queen Elizabeth's final promise. Because Meghan wasn't asking to help Catherine. She was asking to replace Catherine. Just minutes later, Prince William was summoned, and upon learning that Meghan's team had called his wife's patronage a vacant position, William understood that this was no longer a charitable proposal. It was a declaration of war written in the language of the palace. William didn't want Catherine to learn about this through a cold memo or a whisper in the palace corridors. He brought the news to her himself. The meeting was private, with no secretary, no advisor, and no one standing between them. Catherine sat silently as William explained that Meghan had formally requested temporary control over the Queen's Covenant for Children and Families. She didn't interrupt. She didn't get angry. She didn't ask what Meghan had said about her. But when William reread the phrase used in the submission, the calm expression on Catherine's face suddenly changed. Blank. She only repeated those two words. But for William, that was enough to understand the pain his wife was trying to hide. Catherine had never given up her guardianship. She only temporarily reduced her public duties to focus on recovering her health, protecting her family, and preparing for a cautious return. Meetings were still being kept up. Long-term programs were still being monitored, and her responsibility to the covenant never disappeared. Yet in Meghan's request, that absence was described as a power vacuum, as if Catherine had walked away, as if the years she dedicated to children, family, and early childhood development never existed. What hurt Catherine most wasn't Meghan's desire for a larger role. It was the timing Meghan chose to make the request. It was when Catherine was most vulnerable, when every appearance was scrutinized, when every sign of fatigue became headline news, when the silence necessary for recovery could be interpreted by others as weakness. Meghan's team argued that the covenant needed a woman with stronger leadership, more frequent appearances, and who could take the organization global. But for Catherine, the real message was clear. She was no longer strong enough to hold on to what had been entrusted to her. That patronage didn't come to Catherine simply because she held a royal title. For years, she had built her work around children, parental mental health, family stability, and the early years that can determine a child's future. That's why Queen Elizabeth II trusted her with this role. In her own instructions, the late Queen didn't describe it as a temporary task, or a position that could change depending on her public appearances. She called it a long-term obligation, a promise placed in Catherine's hands. William saw the pain behind his wife's silence. Catherine wasn't worried about losing a title. She was hurt that her dedication had been reduced to a mere period of absence. And William understood that Catherine's restraint was being mistaken by some for weakness. He told her that this was no longer just a dispute over a charity. It was an attempt to determine whether illness could erase loyalty. Meanwhile, in the king's study, Charles continued reading the submission. Then he stopped at some unusual phrases. It wasn't the usual language of charity. These were words only found in secret palace files, and at that moment, Charles realized Meghan couldn't possibly have known this information herself. Charles set the submission down on the table, but this time he wasn't reading it as a charitable offer. He was reading it as a document prepared with inside knowledge. In the appendix, Meghan's team mentioned an extremely rare clause, a mechanism for maintaining temporary authority. According to this provision, if a member of the royal family is unable to appear publicly for a period, the king can authorize another person to assist in running the patronage. But that clause had never been publicly disclosed. It wasn't in press releases. It wasn't in documents intended for outside organizations. And almost no one outside a very small group within the palace knew exactly how it was worded. Charles immediately understood that Meghan hadn't discovered this loophole herself. Someone had shown her where to look. William began tracing every name, every call, and every document requested in the preceding months. The investigation quickly led him back to a ceremony at St. James's Palace, which had taken place a few months before the letter appeared. That day, the Queen's Covenant held its annual signing ceremony. Catherine was unable to attend due to health reasons. Princess Anne delivered the speech on her behalf, but Anne deliberately avoided sitting in Catherine's seat. The seat was left empty, a clear message. Catherine was absent, but her place remained intact. No one knew that this very symbol of loyalty was about to become evidence of another scheme. Among those in attendance was Sir Malcolm Avery, a former palace advisor who had helped draft the Covenant's early administrative rules. Seeing the empty seat, he had told some guests that if Catherine were absent for an extended period, the king could technically appoint a temporary assistant. Perhaps to Avery, this was merely a procedural remark, but an American charity executive overheard it. A few days later, in a private call, this person relayed the information to Meghan. And from that moment, the empty chair was no longer seen as a symbol of waiting. It was seen as an opportunity. Meghan's team of advisors began collecting images from the ceremony. They analyzed how Anne stood next to the chair. They studied Catherine's absences. They investigated who was signing documents, who was approving schedules, and whether it could be argued that the organization was lacking a permanent executive. William then discovered a detail that made all suspicions even more serious. Meghan's legal counsel contacted Sir Malcolm Avery not once, but 3 times. The questions they asked were far from general. They wanted to know the exact legal status of the covenant. They inquired about the funding, about the right to use the royal seal, regarding the organization's ability to represent it abroad. And most importantly, they asked what process would allow the king to appoint a temporary manager. But there was one thing they didn't mention. The temporary supporter must be a working member of the royal family. And that person must work under Catherine, not replace her. Meghan had stepped down from her official royal role, so from the start she didn't meet the requirement. William believes this detail wasn't overlooked by mistake. It was deliberately omitted. When Catherine was shown the photos of the empty chair that had been shared within Meghan's advisory group, She was silent for seconds. What chilled her wasn't the image of the chair. It was the fact that her absence due to health had been interpreted as a weakness in the system. A period of recovery had been turned into a power vulnerability. Charles immediately summoned Sir Malcolm Avery to the palace. In the private room, Avery admitted that he had said too much and hadn't considered the consequences. As he rose to leave, he even left his cane beside his chair. Charles gazed at the cane for a long time. Then he told William that even a careless word could become a weapon in the hands of someone seeking power. But then news arrived. Meghan was in London, and she no longer wanted to negotiate through lawyers. She wanted to confront the king directly, not through the secretary, not through the lawyer, and not through any intermediary message from Prince Harry. The meeting was arranged at Clarence House. When Meghan suggested bringing her advisors into the room, Charles refused. He said this was first and foremost a family matter. If the exchange failed, then the lawyers would be allowed in. Meghan sat opposite the king with a carefully marked stack of documents. She didn't begin with an apology or any acknowledgement of Catherine. Instead, she stated directly that the Queen's covenant was being hampered by the palace's excessive caution. According to Meghan, the organization had the potential to become a global platform, but was being held back by outdated patterns. She believed she could bring things that Catherine and the current royal apparatus couldn't. International donors, major partnerships outside of Britain, global media influence, and the ability to deliver the covenant's message to millions of families in a very short amount of time. Meghan emphasized that children shouldn't suffer simply because the royal family fears change. That argument silenced the room, because on the surface it sounded reasonable. The more attention a charity receives, the more opportunities it has to raise funds and expand its influence. But Charles wasn't convinced. He looked directly at Meghan and asked the question she had been avoiding from the start. Why wasn't Catherine consulted? Meghan responded almost immediately. She said there was no need to ask permission from someone whose inactivity itself created the need for intervention. That was the moment Charles's composure began to crumble. He slammed the documents down on the table. Catherine did not abandon the covenant. She stepped back to recover. She was protecting her health, her family, and her ability to continue serving for a long time. No one had the right to turn that painful period into an opportunity to seize what had been given to her. Meghan did not back down. She said she was all too familiar with being excluded from roles she was perfectly capable of. Then she mentioned something that had never been publicly revealed. According to Meghan, Queen Elizabeth had considered giving her a significant role related to the Commonwealth. But then that opportunity vanished, while Catherine continued to receive greater trust patronage and an increasingly secure position in the future of the monarchy. Meghan believed the palace had transferred an opportunity that could have been hers to Catherine. For her, demanding control of the covenant was not an act of usurpation. That was a way to rectify a long-standing injustice. Charles listened intently. Then he said something Meghan wasn't prepared to hear. It was true that Queen Elizabeth had considered various roles for Meghan, but she was also the one who had excluded Meghan from the covenant's line of succession. Not because Meghan lacked influence, not because she wasn't intelligent enough, but because the Queen feared royal power could be mixed with independent brands' commercial interests and media campaigns outside the palace's control. Meghan looked at Charles, saying nothing, and just then the back door opened. William entered first. Catherine followed. The room immediately became more tense, but Catherine didn't accuse Meghan of jealousy. She didn't ask why Meghan wanted her role, nor did she mention the years of tension between them. Catherine simply looked at Meghan and asked a very simple question. Why is my work described as abandoned instead of merely temporarily reduced? Meghan could talk about the children, about the donors, about global influence. But she couldn't answer that question without acknowledging that Catherine's absence had been seen as an opportunity. Charles looked at each person in the room and finally understood that the meeting was no longer about the effectiveness of charity. It was about the right to replace someone else. It was about who deserved a place within the monarchy. and it was about whether a promise from Queen Elizabeth could be broken simply because of pressure. Charles stood up and declared that he would not make a decision that day. He ordered the reopening of all of Queen Elizabeth's personal directives concerning the covenant. This time, the decision will not be made based on emotion. It will be decided by the very words that the late Queen left behind. The following morning, King Charles did not convene any further meetings with his media advisors or lawyers. Instead, he went to Windsor, not to seek a new solution, but to verify whether he still had the right to change his mother's final promise. In the quiet library of the castle, only 3 people were present: Charles, Princess Anne, and the private seal keeper, the official responsible for safeguarding the monarch's most important constitutional documents. No one began a conversation immediately, until Anne placed a dark blue file sealed years earlier on the table. She looked at Charles and said softly, "I was there when Mother signed these documents." Anne had witnessed Queen Elizabeth II's final instructions concerning the Queen's covenant for children and families. Therefore, she didn't need to speculate on her mother's intentions. She had heard her own explanation. As the envelope was opened, the instructions gradually became apparent. It clearly stated that illness should never be considered a surrender. Pregnancy should never be considered a surrender. Family responsibilities should never be considered a surrender. And reducing public appearances should never create a void for someone else to take over. The document also emphasized that Catherine was chosen not because of the number of times she appeared in front of the cameras. She was chosen because of her qualities, her steadfastness, and the trust that Queen Elizabeth had placed in her after years of observation. Each line Charles read undermined the foundation of Meghan's petition. He set the document down quietly, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden behind the castle. After a few minutes of silence, Charles said something he probably never admitted to anyone. He wasn't just worried about Catherine. He was worried about Harry too. If he definitively rejected Meghan, the gap between him and his youngest son might never be mended. He had promised to protect both his sons' families, and now it seemed he was forced to choose. Anne didn't deny the pain. She understood that Charles was both a father and a king, but she asked her brother in a calm, almost cold voice, if keeping Harry closer meant losing Catherine's trust, was that still protecting the family? Charles didn't answer. Anne continued, and if for fear of losing a son he was willing to disregard his mother's final instructions, what meaning did her words have? The room fell silent again. The keeper of the seal turned to the end of the file and pointed to a clause marked in red ink. That was the decisive clause. This patronage could not be transferred to anyone who had left their role as a working member of the royal family. Similarly, it could not be given to anyone intending to combine royal status with a brand or independent operation outside the system. At that moment, Anne provided further information that Charles had never been fully informed of. Meghan's representatives had contacted the organization to request permission to use the covenant's official seal on a set of international fundraising documents. Significantly, this request was sent before the formal application even reached the king's desk. This could only lead to one conclusion. Meghan's team had prepared everything as if the takeover of the covenant was a certainty. Not just the plan, not just the documents, but also the media campaign and fundraising activities were already ready to be activated. Charles slowly walked to the window, pulled back the curtain, and stood still for a few seconds. When he turned back, the hesitation in his eyes had vanished. He looked at Anne and said in a firm voice, "There will be no negotiation regarding my mother's promise." This was no longer the decision of a father trying to keep his family together. It was the decision of a king protecting what his predecessor had bequeathed to him. That same afternoon, Charles signed off on the formal refusal sent to Meghan. But he had no idea that before the letter reached its recipient, the contents of the decision had leaked from the palace. And within hours, a crisis that had been kept secret behind the doors of Windsor began to spread to the public. King Charles's formal refusal was only 6 paragraphs long. There were no attacks, no outrage, and no room for further negotiation. The first paragraph rejected the entire claim to take over the Queen's Covenant for children and families. The second ended Meghan's team's access to internal advisors and documents related to the organization. The third froze any previous informal discussions. The remaining 3 paragraphs affirmed what the palace believed should never have needed to be debated. Catherine never left her role. The patronage was never vacant, and any documents, symbols, or designs using the royal seal without permission had to be immediately withdrawn. The letter was delivered to Meghan's residence in London. After reading it, she remained silent for a few seconds. Then she turned to Harry and said that the palace had once again chosen Catherine's image over that of children who could be helped globally. Harry didn't immediately agree. He asked Meghan a very direct question. "Do you really think Father will strip Catherine of her patronage and give it to you?" Meghan looked down at the documents in her hand. Then she admitted that she had expected it. That answer silenced Harry. For the first time, the true purpose of the plan was clearly stated. Meghan didn't just want to support Catherine during her recovery. She was preparing to become Catherine's replacement. And that same day, the palace began to discover how far the plan had progressed. A communications officer found a draft press release with the title, "A New Global Chapter for the Queen's Covenant." The document was written as if Meghan's takeover had already been approved. It described her as someone who would expand the organization, internationally build a new funding network, and become the face of a more modern era. Soon after, international fundraising documents were also discovered. On some of the designs, the royal seal was placed next to Meghan's name. A photographer had been booked outside a children's center. Even a schedule for her first appearance in her new role had been prepared with specific times, locations, and media messages. William reviewed the entire file and came to a cold conclusion. If Charles agreed, Meghan's team would immediately announce victory. If Charles refused, they could use those very plans to exert public pressure, making the palace appear to have obstructed a campaign to help children. According to William, this was no longer an offer. It was a strategy designed to win in both cases. Meanwhile, Catherine received the full schedule of activities for the Covenant. Advisors awaited her response. A strong statement was prepared. Some suggested publicly releasing all the documents to prove Meghan had acted intentionally. But Catherine refused. She didn't want a retaliatory campaign. She didn't want Meghan's name mentioned in upcoming activities. And she didn't want any children's programs to be used as a backdrop for the family conflict. Catherine simply said, "Children cannot be pawns in a war they didn't choose." Upon hearing that statement, Charles realized Catherine held all the reasons to retaliate. She had the documents. She had William's support. There was the power of the palace. And there was the growing public outrage. But Catherine chose to remain restrained. It was in that moment that Charles understood better than ever why Queen Elizabeth had chosen her. Not because Catherine didn't know how to fight, but because she knew when power shouldn't be used. But the crisis had begun to leak into the media. Questions about Meghan's secret trip to London were popping up more and more frequently. And before the headlines could completely control the story, Catherine sent a private request to the king. She wanted to meet Charles at Windsor, alone. Catherine arrived at Windsor alone. Without William, without Camilla, without a private secretary, legal counsel, or any member of the media team. She carried only a thin stack of documents and walked into the room where King Charles was waiting. But before Catherine could speak, Charles spoke. He apologized, not in diplomatic language, not with a prepared statement, but with a direct admission that Meghan's petition should never have gone so far as to force Catherine to defend a role already bestowed upon her by Queen Elizabeth. Charles admitted his hesitation had caused hurt. He had allowed considerations of Harry, Meghan, and the media reaction to drag on for too long. And during that time, the certainty Catherine should have had was replaced by doubt. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she spoke of something she had never admitted before. Since reducing her public appearances, she had begun to wonder if her family still saw her the same way. Would those around her think she had become weak? Would her temporary absence lead people to believe that someone else could step in and take over everything she had built? It wasn't the fear of losing her title. It was the fear of being seen as replaceable. Charles immediately dismissed that. He said that a temporary period of weakness couldn't erase years of dedication. It couldn't erase loyalty. It couldn't erase the trust Queen Elizabeth had placed in Catherine, and it certainly couldn't diminish a person's value simply because they needed time to recover. But Catherine didn't go to Windsor to ask for a personal guarantee, nor did she ask Charles to punish Meghan. Instead, Catherine said she somewhat understood the motives behind the action. According to her, Meghan was trying to prove that leaving her royal role didn't make her any less important. She wanted to prove that she could still possess equal or even greater influence than those who remained within the palace. But Catherine also made it clear that sympathy couldn't erase the damage. Understanding the cause doesn't mean accepting the consequence. Therefore, she made a suggestion, not to protect Catherine alone, but to protect any woman in the future who might find herself in a similar situation. Catherine wanted the terms of the covenant rewritten. It should clearly state that illness cannot be considered an abandonment. Pregnancy cannot be considered an abandonment. Family responsibilities cannot be considered an abandonment. And any temporary absence cannot create a power vacuum for others to exploit. Charles looked at her for a long time. Then he admitted he had considered a stronger measure. He had wanted to strip Meghan of all rights to mention the covenant, the organization's history, and any connection to past royal campaigns. But Catherine shook her head. She said, "Protect the institution, but don't create another public war." According to Catherine, if Charles turned this decision into a personal punishment, the story would never end. It would only shift from a dispute over patronage to a new war of retaliation. Charles stepped forward, took Catherine's hand, and said that from this moment on, her restraint would never again be misinterpreted as weakness. Right in that meeting, he signed the directive establishing a charter to permanently protect the covenant. No future monarch could use absence due to health or family reasons to strip a position already held. No one could unilaterally declare a position vacant, and no replacement could be appointed without the consent of the current patron. Before Catherine left, Charles asked her one last question. "Do you think you will forgive Meghan?" Catherine was silent for a moment. Then she replied, "Forgiveness may come in private, but trust cannot be restored by pretending that the betrayal never happened." Charles said nothing more, because he understood Catherine did not choose revenge, but she also did not choose to forget. And just as the charter was being sent to advisors for publication, a copy of Meghan's rejected application appeared in a large newsroom. In just a few minutes, the story that the palace had tried to keep secret was ready to become a nationwide debate in England. When news of the rejected application spread outside the palace, the story quickly transcended the realm of a family feud. The media began questioning whether royal patronage was a promise built over years of service, or simply a platform that could be transferred to someone with greater influence. Meghan didn't release the entire document. The wording within could have led the public to believe Catherine wasn't seen as someone recovering, but rather as an obstacle to be replaced. But Catherine didn't see the public's supportive reaction as a victory. She demanded the covenant immediately return to its work with children and families. When she appeared at a center in South London, the crowd applauded at length. Catherine was moved, but said nothing against Meghan. Later, King Charles announced the new charter. Catherine was confirmed as the permanent chief administrator. No temporary absence could create a vacancy. Only working members of the royal family are allowed to provide support, and all appointments require Catherine's approval. Meghan left England without implementing her planned media campaign. Charles destroyed unauthorized promotional materials, closed legal loopholes, and stripped Sir Malcolm Avery of his access to confidential files. After his first official appearance, Charles simply told Catherine, "The promise remains," Catherine replied. "Then the work can continue." And that is the greatest value of this story. A person should not be erased simply because they are temporarily weak. Power should not be used to fill voids, but to protect those who need time to recover. In the royal family, ambition can open a door, but only loyalty determines who is allowed to walk through and stay. If you enjoy royal stories, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching.